First off, I always get in trouble by using when I'm like I was in Texas a year ago at several colleges, and I get in trouble by using the word Chicano because Chicano is a new word. It's only well, I actually first heard it around Los Angeles about 1940, about 48. It was the first time I'd heard the word, and it was only used by a small group of people. My folks hadn't heard the word except in a completely different meaning. And there are some say that Chicano is related to a word which means a pigsty. And there are some say that it derived from from the word chicanery, which is kind of spelled the same. And so there are many Mexican Americans who the conservative old line type particularly, who do not like the word Chicano a bit. And then there are the East Los Angeles activists, which is the mecca of activity for Chicanos, where they don't want you to call them anything else. And it's very much like the word Yankee. Now, to someone in the South, a Yankee is a Northerner. And to a European, a Yankee is an American, period. To most of us, a Yankee is someone from the New England states. I know that's what my idea of a Yankee was. Someone from the New England states was a real Yankee. Well, Chicano is kind of the same way. It means different things to different people, and one of these days, I think that everybody of the Chicano heritage will use the word Chicano. It will be acceptable. Everybody will settle on it. I don't know. Brings me to one other thing. The Chicano history and culture is a very difficult thing. When I use the word Chicano or Mexican American, what I'm talking about is the people who are American citizens by birth here who are of Mexican descent. Now, these people are a world removed from Mexicans from Mexico. Now, that seems very odd, but they're a world removed from it, primarily because they have been raised in a white racist society. And what this does to a person with America's color consciousness, what this does to a person of dark skin, is actually devastating. Now, I've heard some of the stupidest statements I've ever heard came from politicians in California. And one politician, there was a meeting hall about this big, and it was on something about the Chicano problems. And this idiotic politician, he said, why is it, and here he's got, Mexican Americans with PhDs who had all gone to Sacramento to hear this hearing. He says, why is it that in Mexico you find Mexicans that become doctors and senators and judges, and he might have well have said presidents too. And here you don't find that. Why is it that when a Mexican comes here, he doesn't achieve anything? Why does he lose all his ambition? Well, when he said that, we saw where he was at, and half the people laughed and got up and walked out shaking their heads, and they went back to Los Angeles, because this is what we got to deal with when we got politicians. Well, this brings us to the culture of the Chicano. Now, there isn't a lot of history, and like the blacks have, or like white Americans have. The Chicanos don't have this. When we say Chicano, we are talking about Mexican people of Mexican descent who are Americans. And 85% of all of us here, and they don't know how many there are, they say 10 million, anywhere from 8 million to 15 million. 85% of them, at least, have come from Mexico within the past 2 generations. So when you talk about Chicano history, all you're talking about is about 1 generation of working in the fields, and that's it. Okay? In that way, there is no culture. Now, when you talk about the culture of the people from whom the Southwest, which includes California, Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, Texas, all that country that was seized from Mexico in the Mexican-American War, when you talk about those people, that is irrelevant too. That is also Mexican history. And the people that were in power here and those people, they went back to Mexico. Now, if you go back to the day, I touched on this when I was growing up in California, people used to come up to me and say, well, you come from a family, you're Spanish, aren't you? And I'd say, yes, would almost say, yes, boss, I'm Spanish, but we said, si, senor, and I'd say, yes, whatever you say, sir, sort of thing. And they'd say, well, did you know that the early Spaniards, they were the finest horsemen, and they had Damascus steel swords, and they wooed their senoritas, from balconies, and they had a glorious European heritage and the etiquette and all this. And I believed all that shit for years, until I started, as I say, I started looking back into history and finding out what really happened and where we really came from. And we have our own distinct culture, but it is very new and very recent. Now, the Mexican-American, the Mexican in Mexico can look all around him. The blacks will understand this so well. And he'll see, okay, his doctor's a Mexican. His lawyers are Mexican. The judges are Mexican. The politicians are Mexican. So, but when you take that same kid and you raise him in a white racist society where the cops aren't Mexican, the judges aren't Mexican, the governor has never been a Mexican. Well, yes, he was when California belonged to Mexico. The president will never be a Mexican, and he's never seen anything except himself portrayed as a buffoon or a merciless cutthroat that has a knife, and a big long beard and a big mustache, when that's all he sees. Then he does not become a senator or a doctor, because you have to relate and you have to identify. Now, all this is what really the Chicano history is about. And you can say, but you can take an individual and bring him up and teach him and let him go through college and he'll become one. But he won't, because inside he will come out like what he identifies with, And this is the culture, as I say, it just doesn't go back. 85% of us came from Mexico, and that's Mexican culture. We don't, and our problems here are peculiar. The blacks don't have the Mexican-American problems, primarily because the language thing comes into it. The whites don't have the Mexican-American problems. The Mexicans in Mexico don't have Mexican-American problems. Their problems are all solved. They're all Mexicans. Of course, they got the Indian problem there worse than we do. That's beside the point. So you see, this is what really Chicano culture is about. Somebody had their hand raised at this point. Yes, ma'am.
I'd like to comment on what you're saying about you are what you identify with.
Could you stand up and talk louder so everybody could hear?
It's a situation where the black people had to create heroes, or not create heroes, to bring their black heroes to the surface where people could see them, so black children would have black people to identify with, because a black child can't identify with Roy Rogers or something like that. And it's the same with the Mexican Americans. They have to have someone to identify with so that they can aspire to be what this is.
And that's absolutely right. Yes, that's been part of our culture. Is tragically that there are no people to. Now people are starting to emerge. We have a writer who's written a book called Barrio Boy, Ernesto Galarza, and then there's myself, and we're the only two writers that have published. And my book now has gone into Spanish, and it's being distributed in South America and Spain. It's gone into German for distribution in 5 or 6 countries there, and it's the first Chicano out of all 100 years of history. It's the first Chicano book that's been published and nationally accepted, and that is an indictment. It's not something for me to brag about. It's something that I'm very sorry about, because it isn't that the publishers did not publish these books. It's that there was nobody there to write them, because people who pick grapes don't suddenly sit down at a typewriter and start. They had no background of this, because until recently the migrant workers, and there are, 200,000 in California alone, migrant workers. The kids didn't even go to school until a few years ago. And I mean just a few years ago, a couple, like 3 or 4. Kids weren't going to school. There's a hand raised over here. No, it was over here then. Somebody changed their mind. And, yes. Yeah. In case everybody didn't hear her, she says, don't I agree that now there is a great awakening of pride and this sort of thing? And yes, that's true. However, the Chicano is about where the black man was 20 years ago. And that is the first ones that rise up with the pride and everything. They are all pure bitterness, you know, and all they want to do is lash out and hurt and get revenge. And this is perfectly natural. You know, I heard the great Ernesto Galarza talk at a convention in San Diego a few weeks ago. And he pointed out that there is no group of people in the world who at one time or another were not treated more or less like blacks have been treated or like Mexican Americans have been treated. There's a great, or like the Indians have been treated. There's a great deal of difference in the treatment that each of those groups have had. For one thing, the three, the Mexican American, black, and the Native American, as you call them here, I'm so happy to hear. We never use that term where I come from. They are the only groups in this country that in this country have been absolutely crushed down to nothing and had everything stripped away from them. Had their family life shattered one way or another, had their society, had their language taken away from them. This is everything taken away. Now, this didn't happen with the Japanese American or with the Chinese. It didn't happen with the Jews, you know, in this country like that. Sure, they all suffer discrimination too. I know people today that say the yellow curse whenever they think of a yellow man, you know. But these are the only groups that have really absolutely been crushed. And this is one of the reasons why it's been so terrifically hard for these three groups to try to, in fact, they will never, ever fit into the mainstream of life. So what they're doing, of course, is branching out into their own thing. And then we have different cultures. Now, I don't know if in the long run it's really going to be good that we have different cultures. Because one of the things that happens when you have different cultures is that you have an amalgamation of the group of people that stick harder together. See? Now, intermarriage dropped off sharply along with the black movement, you know. And when we were kids, we were told in one of these fairy tale books that someday there wouldn't be any blacks and everybody would be a nice golden tan. Well, we know that's not going to happen now. You know, the blacks have been getting blacker recently and the whites have been getting whiter. And somebody else had a hand up and I can't remember who it was. Yes, you go ahead. Just a moment. Is my time running out? Pardon? She said, are there any Chicano legislators in California? We did have a congressman for many years, the name of Roy Ball. Nobody in the state Senate. Well, that's just 200,000 crop pickers, and throughout the state, the Chicanos outnumber blacks in California. Well, up until recently, you couldn't vote unless you could read English, and so until recently, there was no. Yes, there's a lot of political. But as I started to say, the Chicanos are about where the blacks were 20 years ago. And the minute one leader rises, he starts getting power for himself, and then they start fighting amongst themselves. See, Whitey's gotten himself together a long time ago, you know. And so this is coming. Just a couple more questions, and then he tells me I have another thing to go to. Yes, sir. You, sir.
Yeah, you say that the Mexican Americans, when they rise up and they become teachers, you know, through the system, they don't want to go back to where they came from. Well, if they don't want to help themselves, how do they expect other people to help?
Well, that perhaps wasn't. You took that a little bit wrong. What I'm saying is the few that have filtered up to the top. Now, there are many coming along who say, look, we've got to learn the skills and get back to the barrio and help our people out. There are many of them. But unfortunately, it takes money to get through school and to get a teaching credential, and there are relatively few of them that are doing it. Another few questions. Yes, sir, you, sir. Well, of course, we're right off. I can say, what do you mean by a strength? What you see as a strength, I might see as a great weakness. Well, I really don't think that there should be anything that we can say, look, we will give this to Whitey and make him stronger. I think that's kind of a ridiculous thing, and this is what you're asking me.
What is there intrinsically about Chicago culture that has a contribution to make that is in itself
Contribution to what?
to human existence, this quality of life in America?
Well, I think the way the family is treated, you know, the way the family treats one another is a tremendous thing. I won't say there aren't any Virginia Woolf type relationships in the Chicano community, but I think that the play I'm talking about, the I'll Be Play, is certainly one of the reasons its popularity, it was so extremely popular, is it personified something that is happening in white America today. The way a man and wife stand there and absolutely scream at each other and call each other names was certainly, that was a very significant play. But it wasn't significant among Chicanos. They didn't like it, you know. And some other country, that was a very interesting thing, by the way. Somebody did a study on how that play was received. You know what I'm talking about? Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf? In some places where marital problems parallel those of the United States, the play was tremendously popular, and in other places they just didn't understand it at all. You know? Which is, you know, she was kind of an emancipated woman in a way, and I know in a lot of Chicano families, if she'd have screamed at her husband and called him a dirty bastard, she'd have got knocked across the room. You know? I don't know whether that's good or bad, but anyway, the play didn't relate to everybody. I enjoyed it thoroughly, though. All righty, this lady here, and then I guess we got to shut it off. You had your hand up?
I think actually this is a problem of the poor. I see some white, I guess that's like the thing is strange to see a black to say, but I would run to myself any day of the year that we live in. Poor white. They don't have a hair.
Mm-hmm.
Really, I think the poor should organize and work together. All people
Boy, you're right.
one common enemy.
Yeah, that's absolutely right, but then you're talking, she says all poor people ought to get together, third world sort of thing. That's right, but it's not going to happen, unfortunately. Incidentally, one other point. No. No, not as long as there's blacks and whites. But they aren't going to get so tired that they're going to send their kids to school with yours. They aren't going to get that tired of it. Yeah. One other point. Yeah. One other point, and then I do, he says I have to shut it off now. One of the reasons I wrote this book, and I'll end on this note here because I have to end somewhere. And that is, when I was in construction work, in some of the unions around L.A., there was a solid Chicano, the union membership. And we had a real strong construction union. Now the carpenters get about $8, $10 an hour. You know, it's a strong union. And there were a lot of us Chicanos in one particular local, and I went to work with them, and we were making, this was back in the 50s, and we were making good money. We were making up to $150, $200 a week, which back then was a lot of money. And all the problems that I saw my fellow workers have, you know, their kids are on narcotics, dropping out of school, in jail, drinking, all the whole problem, all these problems at that time, people said, well, these are the problems poor people have. And then I saw these guys that were making good money, you know, and working steady, good money, buying nice things and everything. And the funny thing happened that all that money didn't make one bit of difference. Their kids were on narcotics, still dropping out of school, still getting in jail, and still they had the drinking problem. And that's one of the reasons that I started going into sociology. At that time, not much had been on it. People figured that if you took poor people with all their problems and gave them some money, that they'd automatically turn into middle-class people, and that just isn't so. And so in this book, it's another thing I tried to put across after I learned why it is that that happens. I tried to put it in fiction form. And I just hope people will go out and buy my book. Excuse me for being mercenary. Yes, ma'am, and then we got to go. Which union is mostly? Well, that happened to be a cement finishers union and plasters, you know. Pardon? AFL-CIO. Yeah. All righty, well, you've been a very good audience, and I've certainly enjoyed being here, and thank you very much.
The question can be continued up there. Oh, before you leave, let me make this announcement. Mr. Vasquez will be up at the Black Culture Center, and this discussion can be continued there. And you're all invited to come if you're not scared. Thank you and good night.